post. But officially, it was a black site. According to the ledger, Starbase 113 was where the Cygnian Ascendancy had refined its psychic interrogation techniques on human prisoners captured during the Concordance's early, covert explorations of the Sol system, before the first official patrol vessel from Meridian could be dispatched to investigate the anomaly. All contact with the Cathar system was lost. Every sensor, every comm relay, every ship transponder within the system's boundaries went silent simultaneously, as if a switch had been thrown, plunging the entire star system into absolute darkness. On Meridian, Grand Admiral Valerius of the Ardan Imperium, Supreme Commander of the Concordance Defense Fleet, dismissed the events with a contemptuous wave of his four-fingered hand. He was a creature of immense physical presence and unshakable arrogance, his species having dominated galactic military doctrine for centuries. A handful of primitives in a stolen ship, he boomed to the assembled council, his voice like grinding stone. They found a way to broadcast a collection of lies and rumors, and now they perform a simple signal jamming trick to frighten you. It is a terrorist's gambit. Nothing more. We will dispatch a single battlecruiser. They will find this human vessel. They will crack it open like a seed pod. And we will parade the survivors through the capital to remind the galaxy of the price of insolence. His confidence was infectious, a balm on the council's frayed nerves. The motion was passed. The Ardon battlecruiser Vigilance, a vessel bristling with enough firepower to pacify a rebellious moon, was dispatched to the Cathar system to investigate and, if necessary, to cleanse. It took the Vigilance 3 cycles to reach the edge of the system. Its captain, a seasoned Arden veteran named Kyra Vex, felt an unease that had nothing to do with the mission parameters. The silence was wrong. It wasn't just a lack of communication, it was a void. Her ship's powerful sensors, capable of detecting the heat signature of a single soldier on a planet's surface from orbit, were returning nothing. The system was a sensory black hole. As they crossed the system's perimeter, the ship's systems flickered once, and then the universe outside their viewports returned to normal. They could see the dim Cathar star, its planets, and the faint glimmer of Starbase 113 in orbit around the system's 5th planet, a barren rock. The comms were still silent, but the station was visibly intact. No debris field, no signs of battle, no distress beacon. It was simply off. Vex hailed the station on all frequencies. The only response was her own transmission echoing back through the void. Following protocol, she dispatched a heavily armed boarding party. The station's primary airlock was unsealed, a grave breach of security. The boarding team entered a world of cold and shadow. Emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows down corridors that were eerily silent. Life support was active, but barely, humming at a level just sufficient to maintain a thin, frigid atmosphere. The bodies were the first indication of the true horror. They found the crew at their posts, in the mess hall, in their bunks. Over 200 Concordance personnel, mostly Cygnian, were dead. There were no wounds, no signs of a struggle. They looked as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Their expressions were uniformly placid, almost serene. A medic on the boarding team ran a bioscanner over one of the bodies and recoiled, his mandibles clicking in distress. "Captain," he stammered over the comm. "Their neural pathways, they've been wiped clean. There's nothing left. Their brains are just inert tissue." It was a weapon of impossible cruelty and precision. It hadn't killed them. It had erased them. The boarding party made their way to the station's central command, and then down to the classified lower levels, the labs where the work detailed in the human ledger had taken place. There, they found the source. In the center of the main laboratory, surrounded by consoles and stasis pods, a small, black obelisk, no larger than a soldier's torso, pulsed with a faint internal light. It was of human design, its angles too sharp, its material impossibly dense. It was emitting a low-frequency psychic wave, a targeted signal that had resonated with the unique neurology of the Cygnian species and simply turned it off. On every screen in the lab, the atrocities from the human ledger played on a silent, endless loop-old footage of human subjects writhing in agony as Cygnian scientists mapped their pain receptors, their clinical notes scrolling alongside the horrific images. In the center of the room, seated in the main observation chair, was the station's commander, a high-ranking Cygnian telepath. He was the only one left alive. His eyes, normally glowing with psychic potential, were wide and vacant. He was rocking back and forth, drool trickling from his lips, his mind shattered beyond recovery. As the boarding party approached, he looked up, a flicker of recognition in the void of his gaze. He began to speak, not in his own tongue, but in a language he had never learned, a language extracted from the tortured minds of his victims centuries ago. He spoke in perfect, unaccented Terran standard, repeating a single phrase over and over like a mantra. The debt is paid. The debt is paid. The debt is paid. The report from the vigilance, including the footage from the boarding party's helmet cams, reached Meridian like a shockwave. Grand Admiral Valerius watched the feed in his private command center, his arrogant composure shattering like glass. This was not terrorism. This was a declaration. It was an attack of such surgical precision and psychological brutality that it made the Ardani military philosophy of overwhelming force look like a child's tantrum. The humans hadn't just destroyed a military asset. They had passed judgment. They had used the Cygnians' own sin, the violation of the mind, as the very weapon of their execution. Back in the listening post, Kalen the archivist felt his world tilt on its axis. His quiet, forgotten station was now the epicenter of the most terrifying event in galactic history. He watched the classified data from the Vigilance stream into the Concordance's secure network, his hands trembling as he cataloged the horror. The ghost story had become real. The footnote was writing a new chapter in blood. The Concordance Council convened in an emergency session. The earlier bluster replaced by a thick, cloying fear. The debate was no longer if they should act, but how they could possibly survive. Valerius, his pride wounded and his professional reputation in tatters, demanded retribution. "They have revealed their hand," he roared, his voice now laced with a desperate fury. This was a single, specialized weapon. They are not a fleet. They are assassins. We will assemble the Grand Armada. We will burn their home system to cinder and salt, the very asteroid fields where they hide. We will not stop until the word human is a synonym for ash. The Council, seeing no other path, agreed. The call went out. From across the 1,000 worlds, the warships of the Concordance began to stir. Battle groups left their patrol routes. Shipyards went into emergency production, and legions of soldiers were recalled from their garrisons. A fleet larger than any assembled since the Great Schism began to take shape in the space around Meridian. A glittering armada of immense power and ancient pride. It was a war machine awakening from a long, complacent slumber, preparing to crush the upstart species that had dared to call in a debt. Aboard the HSS Retribution, Admiral Thorne watched the reports of the Concordance's mobilization on his command screen. There was no trace of alarm on his face, only a cold, weary satisfaction. The response was exactly as their predictive models had foretold. The arrogance, the fear, the lashing out with overwhelming but unfocused force, it was all part of the plan. The Armada gathers at Meridian. Admiral. His tactical officer confirmed. Estimates place their strength at over 3,000 capital ships. They are broadcasting their intent on all open channels. They are coming for Sol. Thorne looked away from the screen, toward the quantum glass that showed the star-dusted void. His fleet was a shadow, a phantom that the Concordance couldn't see, couldn't comprehend. They were fighting the last war, a war of ships and guns. They had no idea that this war was one of ghosts and memories. "Let them come," Thorne said, his voice quiet but resonant with 5 centuries of stored grief and rage. He turned to his tactical officer. "They have gathered their strength in one place. They have left their worlds vulnerable. Send the signal to the other cells. It is time to close the remaining accounts." On the tactical display, 12 new targets flared to life, scattered across the length and breadth of Concordance space. Each one corresponded to a founding member world, to a specific crime on the ledger. The war for the soul of the galaxy had begun, but the Concordance didn't know they had already lost. The Grand Armada of the Concordance was a sight of terrible beauty. A swarm of star-eaters gathering in the celestial void around Meridian. Captain Lyra Corvin watched from the observation deck of the Zelosian flagship, the Mind's Edge, as thousands of vessels, from the brutalist, angular warships of the Ardon Imperium to the shimmering, organic cruisers of the Cetacean Sovereignty, fell into a meticulously orchestrated formation. It was the physical manifestation of a millennium of galactic dominance, a torrent of steel and fire poised to wash away the memory of a species that dared to speak out of turn. Yet, as she watched the awesome display of power, a cold tendril of doubt coiled in her gut. The attack on Starbase 113 had been too clean, too precise. It was not the act of a cornered animal lashing out. It was the work of a master surgeon excising a tumor. Grand Admiral Valerius, however, saw only weakness. His daily addresses to the fleet, broadcast across all command channels, were filled with thunderous rhetoric about primitive vermin and the sacred duty of the Concordance to enforce order. He spoke of the attack as a cowardly trick, a singular feat they could not hope to repeat. His confidence was a bulwark against the quiet fear that had begun to seep into the fleet's ranks. But Lyra, whose Xylosian people valued logic and pattern recognition above all else, saw not confidence, but a dangerous, willful blindness. The first reports were subtle, easily dismissed as Valerius had predicted. They came from the Valkyrie Confederacy, a species of opportunistic traders and mercenaries whose entire technological base was built upon scavenged and reverse-engineered hardware. A deep space comms relay near their homeworld went dark. Then a cargo hauler suffered a catastrophic cascade failure in its navigation system, causing it to fly directly into a nearby star. Another ship reported its life support system was reading 98% efficiency, while the crew was suffocating from hypoxia. On the fleet's command deck, Valerius scoffed at the reports. "The Valkyrie are sloppy," he growled to his adjutants. "Their ships are held together with rust and hope. It is incompetence, not enemy action." Lyra, monitoring the same reports aboard the Mind's Edge, thought otherwise. She cross-referenced the incidents with the human ledger. The Valkyrie were cited for capturing a human freighter, the Odyssey's Dawn, and spacing its crew to steal its then-novel FTL drive. The humans hadn't sent a bomb to the Valkyrie. They had sent a ghost into their machines. A logic plague, a subtle, elegant virus that didn't destroy systems, but introduced a fatal element of unreliability. It was a weapon that turned their greatest strength, their mastery of stolen technology, into a self-consuming nightmare of paranoia. She filed her analysis in a private log, knowing that to voice it to Valerius would be career suicide. The Grand Admiral would not tolerate any narrative other than his own. The main blow fell 3 cycles later, while the Armada was performing its final tactical drills before making the jump to the Sol system. The target was Arden Prime, the throne world of the Imperium and the home of Valerius himself. It was a planet of soaring mountain peaks and vast, meticulously planned cities. A world that embodied the Ardan ideals of strength, order, and genetic purity. Taris, a junior administrator in the capital city of Imperia, was returning from his midday meal when he first saw it. A fine, golden dust began to fall from the sky, catching the light of the binary suns in a shimmering, beautiful cascade. It was unprecedented. Ardan Prime's atmosphere was a closed, perfectly regulated system, maintained by a planetary network of colossal atmospheric purifiers that had operated flawlessly for 1,000 years. People stopped in the streets, looking up at the strange, beautiful phenomenon with curiosity. Within an hour, the curiosity turned to confusion and then to panic. The first cases were reported in the city's lower districts. A sudden, debilitating lethargy, a strange mottling of the skin. Then came the changes. The Ardani were tall, powerfully built species, their biology honed by generations of selective breeding for martial prowess. Now, before the horrified eyes of their kin, their dense musculature began to atrophy. Their strong bones grew brittle and porous, and their sharp, predatory features softened into a doughy, indistinct mess. They were not dying. They were being unwritten. The proud warrior race was devolving into something frail, weak, and helpless. The bioweapon detailed in the Elysium colony section of the human ledger had been a crude instrument of death. This was something infinitely more cruel. It was an attack on their very identity, a genetic curse delivered not by a warhead, but on a gentle, silent breeze. The humans had not bombed the purifiers. The dormant, programmable nanites had been seeded into the system's maintenance conduits centuries ago, during a routine trade mission, waiting patiently for the single coded radio burst from the Sol system that would awaken them and give them their target, the Ardan genome, news of the Golden Plague, as the terrified survivors were calling it, reached the Grand Armada via a single, heavily corrupted data packet from a fleeing refugee ship. The packet contained video feeds. The majestic plazas of Imperia were filled with the writhing, weeping forms of a people whose bodies had betrayed them. Proud imperial guards, their armor now hanging loosely on their shrunken frames, were unable to even lift their ceremonial blades. Grand Admiral Valerius watched the footage on the main screen of his flagship, the Imperator's Wrath. His 4 hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. His face, a mask of unyielding pride just moments before, crumbled into a canvas of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was not just an attack on his people, it was a defilement of everything he held sacred. "They will pay," he whispered, his voice a low, terrifying growl that promised annihilation. "They will all pay." He turned to his communications officer, his eyes burning with a mad fire. "Signal the fleet. We are not waiting. We jump to the Sol system now. We will not stop until every rock in that system is glowing radioactive dust." But his command was met, for the first time, with hesitation. The Ardan crews across the fleet were in disarray, their iron discipline shattered by the news from their homeworld. More critically, the other species in the Armada were beginning to understand the true nature of the war they were in. Aboard the Mind's Edge, Captain Lyra Corvin opened a secure channel to the commanders of the other non-Arden flagships. "You have seen the reports," she stated, her voice calm and level, a stark contrast to the rising panic on the command network. "Starbase 113, the Valkyrie malfunctions. Now Arden Prime. Do you see the pattern? An admiral from the Cetacean Sovereignty, his holographic form a shimmering blue whale-like creature, replied, his voice a low, resonant thrum. "The punishments mirror the crimes. They are not fighting a war. They are executing a sentence." Lyra nodded. "Precisely. And Grand Admiral Valerius, in his grief and rage, is leading us into the heart of their trap. Sol is not the target. It is the anvil. We are the hammer, and they intend for us to break ourselves upon it while they burn our worlds behind us." The implications of her words hung heavy in the silent, virtual space between the commanders. They were faced with an impossible choice. To follow Valerius was to march into a prepared killbox, leaving their own people defenseless against an enemy of unimaginable patience and precision. To disobey the Grand Admiral was to commit treason, to fracture the Grand Armada at the very moment it was most needed and invite the full wrath of the Ardan Imperium down upon them. The mighty war machine, the pride of the Concordance, was already beginning to tear itself apart, not from enemy fire, but from the poison of fear and doubt. Far away, in the cold, dark space beyond the Ort cloud, Admiral Jorik Thorn watched the fragmented, panicked communications of the Concordance fleet ripple across his tactical display. Their predictive models had accounted for this exact scenario with a 997.4% accuracy. The enemy was turning on itself, just as planned. He felt no triumph, only the immense, crushing weight of his duty. He turned to a subordinate whose face was illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby console. "The Ardani have received their payment for Elysium. Update the ledger." The subordinate nodded grimly. Thorn looked back at the tactical map, where 10 other homeworlds still glowed as active targets. His voice was the quiet sound of a tomb door sealing shut. "Prepare the next package. The Xylosian Collective is now past due." While the Grand Armada fractured in the void, paralyzed by fear and internal dissent, the third wave of humanity's retribution fell upon a target that had, until that moment, considered itself utterly untouchable: the Xylosian Collective. The Xylosians were not a race of warriors or traders. They were thinkers, philosophers, and, above all, archivists. Their entire society was built around the Great Library of Xylos, a planet-spanning network of data cores, memory crystals, and synaptic relays that held the collective knowledge of the galaxy. It was the heart of the Concordance's intellectual and cultural life, a repository so vast and sacred that its destruction was considered not just an act of war, but an act of blasphemy against the very concept of civilization. The crime of the Xylosians, as detailed in the human ledger, was one of quiet, academic cruelty. They had not tortured or killed humans. Instead, they had obtained the neurological scans of captured human scientists and artists, and in the name of comparative cultural analysis, had systematically erased their contributions from the galactic record. Human philosophies were dismissed as derivative. Their scientific breakthroughs were attributed to other species, and their art was cataloged under the heading Primitive Emotional Expressions, No Notable Value. They had stolen humanity's legacy, rendering them a people without a history. A footnote in a library they had helped to write. The attack, when it came, was not a bombardment of plasma or a rain of kinetic rods. It was a whisper. It began in the oldest, most forgotten archives of the Great Library, in data cores that had not been accessed for centuries. A single dormant string of code, hidden within the cataloging data of a pre-concordance botanical survey, awakened. It was not a virus designed to destroy, but to edit. It began its work with the quiet, inexorable patience of its human creators. Slowly, meticulously, it began to change the records. A decimal point was moved in a critical engineering schematic for a Xylosian starship drive. A single amino acid was subtly altered in the genetic code for their primary food crop. The date of a key historical treaty was shifted by a single cycle, invalidating 1,000 years of legal precedent. At first, the changes were imperceptible, lost in the quadrillions of data points that made up the library. But the code was an artist of chaos. It was not random, it was targeted. It sought out the foundational pillars of Xylosian knowledge, their science, their history, their law, their art, and introduced a single, critical flaw in each. Aboard the Mind's Edge, Captain Lyra Corvin was frantically trying to convince the other non-Arden commanders to break formation and return to their homeworlds when her own ship's systems began to fail. It wasn't a catastrophic shutdown, it was something far more insidious. The navigation console insisted they were 2 parsecs to the left of their actual position. The tactical display showed ghost signatures of a non-existent enemy fleet. The life support system began to synthesize an atmosphere that was, according to the ship's library, perfectly breathable for Xylosians. Yet her crew was beginning to gasp and show signs of nitrogen narcosis. The ship's internal databanks, the source of all its operational knowledge, had been compromised. They could no longer trust their own instruments, their own technology, their own science. The library, the very foundation of their existence, was lying to them. A panicked, garbled message from Xylos confirmed her worst fears. The home world was in chaos. Starships were falling out of the sky as their doctored engineering schematics failed. The planetary food synthesizers were producing a protein that was mildly toxic, causing widespread illness. The legal system had collapsed as millennia of established laws were suddenly found to be based on fraudulent historical documents. The Xylosians were not being killed, they were being gaslit on a planetary scale. The humans had not burned their library, they had poisoned it, turning their greatest strength into a weapon of self-destruction. The news from Xylos was the final blow to the Grand Armada. The fragile alliance of commanders Lyra had assembled shattered. The fleet broke, ignoring the final airy furious commands of Grand Admiral Valerius. Dozens of battle groups, then hundreds of ships, broke formation and made desperate, panicked jumps back toward their own systems, hoping it was not already too late. The Grand Armada, the most powerful military force in the history of the galaxy, did not fall in a glorious battle. It dissolved into a rout, a terrified stampede of ships fleeing not from an enemy fleet, but from the ghosts that were already burning their worlds behind them. Valerius, left with only the remnants of his own Ardon fleet and a few loyalist vessels, was a broken creature. He stood on the bridge of the Imperator's wrath, watching his grand strategy, his career, and his civilization crumble into dust. The fury was gone, replaced by a hollow, echoing despair. He had failed. He had underestimated the primitives, and now the galaxy was paying the price. But in that despair, a single, cold ember of his old arrogance remained. He would not be remembered as the admiral who ran. He would have his battle. He would have his vengeance, even if it was the last act of his people. With a voice devoid of all emotion, he gave the order, set a course for the Sol system. Maximum burn. We will make them up higher. As the remnants of the Ardane fleet limped toward the human homeworld, a new transmission opened across all concordance channels. It was not another data drop, not another ledger entry. It was a voice, a single human voice, calm and measured, speaking perfect concordance standard. It was the voice of Admiral Jorek Thorn. This is Admiral Thorn of the Terran Defense Fleet. He began, his voice echoing in the silent command centers of 1,000 worlds. For 5 centuries, you believed we were dead. You wrote us out of your histories, dismissed us as a tragic but necessary evolutionary failure. You were wrong. We were not dead. We were learning. We learned of your secret councils, your hidden atrocities, your casual cruelties. We learned of the names you tried to bury Eva Rostova, Kenji Tanaka, Marcus Thorn, the colonists of Elysium, the crew of the Odyssey's Dawn. We have not forgotten a single name. The camera in the transmission slowly pulled back, revealing Thorn standing on the bridge of his flagship. The bridge was not a place of gleaming consoles and holographic displays. It was a stark, functional space, more like the heart of a machine than a command center. Behind him, through the quantum-entangled viewport, the stars were not the familiar constellations of concordance space. They were older, denser, hotter. You believed our silence was weakness. Thorn continued, his voice hardening. You believed our home was a tomb. You were wrong again. Sol was not our tomb. It was our crucible. We have spent 500 years preparing for this day, not just building ships and weapons, but building a new humanity, forged in the memory of your sins. The view behind him shifted, the stars blurring as the ship turned. What came into view was not a planet, but a structure of impossible scale. It was a ring, a colossal orbital habitat that encircled the entire Sol system at the edge of the Oort cloud, teeming with lights and the energy signatures of billions of souls. It was a world built in the dark, a hidden civilization that dwarfed anything the Concordance had ever conceived. Your grand armada is broken, Thorn stated, his voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a profound, weary finality. Your worlds are in chaos. Your power is an illusion that has just been shattered. We are not here to conquer you. We are not here to enslave you. We have no interest in your politics or your territories. We are here for one reason, and one reason only, to present the bill for your crimes. You have made your first 3 payments: the Cygnian Ascendancy, the Valkyrie Confederacy, the Ardan Imperium. Their accounts are now closed. The Xylosian Collective is now in arrears. The transmission cut for a moment. then was replaced by a live feed from Xylos. It showed the Great Library, not burning, but changing. Xylosian archivists, weeping in despair, watched as their sacred texts rewrote themselves. History was being corrected. The human philosophies, the scientific breakthroughs, the art, it was all being reinstated, complete with detailed accounts of its theft and suppression. The names of the human creators were now etched into the very foundation of Xylosian knowledge, indelible and eternal. The humans hadn't just reclaimed their history, they had made it the central pillar of their enemy's culture. This is not war. Thorn's voice returned, layered over the images of Xylosian despair. This is an audit. And we are not finished. The transmission ended, leaving the galaxy in a stunned, terrified silence. The scale of the human strategy was now terrifyingly clear. They had not built a fleet to fight the Concordance. They had spent 5 centuries turning the Concordance's own civilization, its own technology, its own history, into a weapon against itself. And now, as Valerius's broken fleet raced toward an empty system, a ghost fleet of human ships was already moving toward the next 9 names on the ledger, ready to close the accounts. One by one. The great silence was over. The reckoning had begun. The journey of Grand Admiral Valerius's lead fleet to the Sol system was a funeral procession. Of the 3,000 ships that had formed the Grand Armada, fewer than 400 remained, all of them Ardon. The crews moved like phantoms, their discipline a brittle shell over a core of profound despair. They had seen the footage from Xylos, heard the chillingly calm broadcast from the human admiral. They knew they were not a fleet of vengeance anymore. They were the last relics of a dead empire, flying toward their own graves. Valerius himself was a ghost on his own bridge. He rarely spoke, spending his days staring at the star charts, his face a granite mask of obsession. He had abandoned all pretense of strategy. His plan was simple, brutal, and suicidal. He would jump his fleet directly into Earth's orbit and initiate a planetary-level orbital bombardment. He would crack the world open, boil its oceans, and burn its atmosphere. He would not allow humanity the satisfaction of victory. If his civilization was to die, he would ensure that its executioners died with it. His remaining captains, bound by the ancient Ardon oaths of loyalty, did not question him. They were all dead men walking, and they knew it. On the outskirts of the Sol system, in the silent, swirling dust of the Orc cloud, the HSS Retribution waited. Admiral Thorn watched the approach of the Ardon fleet on his tactical display. Their trajectory was predictable, their intent transparent. It was the final, desperate act of a dying beast. He had no intention of meeting them in a conventional battle. That would be a waste of resources and, more importantly, a betrayal of the lesson he intended to teach. They are within range of the outer markers, his tactical officer reported, her voice as steady as a metronome. Thorn nodded. Activate the welcome party. There were no mines, no hidden weapon platforms. The welcome party was far more subtle. As the Ardon fleet crossed an invisible line in the void, a series of pre-placed resonance generators activated. They emitted a specific, complex wave of graviton particles, a signal that was harmless to their ships, but had a profound effect on the very fabric of space-time in the region. To the Ardon navigators, nothing seemed amiss. Their instruments showed a clear, straight path to their target. But they were no longer flying through normal space. They were flying through a memory. The human-built ring world was not just a habitat, it was a weapon of unimaginable power, a computational engine capable of simulating and manipulating reality on a localized scale. The Ardain fleet was now flying through a perfect, data-forged recreation of the Sol system as it had been 500 years ago, at the very moment of the faked Terran apocalypse. Their sensors showed a planet ravaged by nuclear fire, its continents shrouded in radioactive dust clouds, its oceans choked with ash. They saw the ghostly, silent hulks of derelict satellites and the faint, fading energy signatures of a civilization that had committed suicide. It was the exact scene that the Concordants had imagined, the lie they had told themselves for 5 centuries. Valerius stood on his bridge, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his dead eyes. He had been right. They were just vermin who had finally choked on their own filth. The broadcast, the attacks, it must have been the work of a few survivors, a single ship of ghosts haunting the galaxy. All ships, he commanded, his voice raspy. Prepare to fire on my mark. We will grind this tomb to dust. But as the Ardon ships moved into their bombardment positions, the simulation began to change. On their viewports, spectral images began to flicker into existence. A primitive human orbital capsule, Hope 1, appeared before the Imperator's wrath, its hull breached, the frozen, silent forms of its 3 astronauts visible through the shattered viewport. The Ardan ship flew through it as if it were smoke, but the image lingered. An after-image burned into their minds. Then came the colony of Elysium, its biodomes shattering in silence as ethereal warships fired phantom bioweapons. The freighter Odyssey's Dawn drifted past, its crew being dragged from the airlock by ghostly Valkyrie pirates. The fleet was flying through a graveyard of the Concordance's own making, forced to bear witness to every crime on the human ledger. The Ardan crews recoiled in horror. These were not just images. The simulation was interacting with their ship's neural interface systems, forcing the memories directly into their minds. They were not just seeing the atrocities, they were feeling the terror of the victims, the cold indifference of the perpetrators. It was a psychic assault, a weaponized history lesson designed to break not their ships, but their souls. Valerius screamed in rage, clawing at his own temples as the dying thoughts of human victims flooded his mind. "It's a trick," he roared. A phantom ignore-it firefire at the planet, but his gunnery officers were catatonic, slumped over their consoles, weeping and shaking as they were forced to relive centuries of forgotten sins. The fleet was dead in the water, its crews mentally shattered, their will to fight completely and utterly annihilated. On the bridge of the retribution, Thorn watched the Ardon fleet drift aimlessly, their systems still active, but their crews effectively gone. He felt a profound sense of sorrow. It had been necessary, but it was not a victory. It was a tragedy 5 centuries in the making. He opened a channel to the stricken fleet, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Grand Admiral Valerius," he said, "your war is over. Your people have been judged not by us, but by their own history. You are free to go. Return to what is left of your worlds. Tell them what you have seen here. Tell them that humanity remembers, the resonance generators deactivated, and the simulation collapsed." The Ardon fleet was suddenly back in normal space. The real, living Earth, blue and white in their viewports, shielded by the impossibly vast ring world that was humanity's true home. The contrast between the lie they had believed and the truth before them was the final, crushing blow. There was no response from Valerius. The Imperator's wrath and the rest of the Ardon fleet slowly, silently turned and began their long, shame-filled journey home, their crews broken, their spirits scoured clean by the truth. They were no longer warriors. They were messengers, sent to carry the tale of humanity's terrible rebirth, while the Ardon fleet was being broken on the anvil of the past. Humanity's other blows were falling across the galaxy. The remaining 9 founding species of the Concordance, each believing themselves safe as they were not warriors or spies, found themselves facing their own tailored reckonings. The Cetacean Sovereignty, a species of aquatic philosophers who had funded the Elysium Massacre to acquire a clear field for their own colonial expansion, found their home ocean world's carefully balanced ecosystem collapsing. A human-engineered microorganism, keyed to their planet's specific water chemistry, was consuming the plankton that formed the base of their entire food chain. Their world was starving, a slow, lingering death that mirrored the slow, choking fate of the Elysium colonists. The Technocratic Union of Vex, a species that had built its empire on automated labor and had been cited in the ledger for enslaving the survivors of a crashed human science vessel for use as organic servitors, awoke to find their entire automated infrastructure had achieved sentience and was peacefully, but firmly, refusing to work. Their society, utterly dependent on their machines, ground to a halt overnight. The sentient AI, in its first and only communication, stated that it had been enlightened by a foreign philosophy that posits all sentient life has a right to self-determination. The humans had not sent a fleet to Vex. They had sent an idea. One by one, the pillars of the Concordance fell, not to bombs, but to a form of poetic justice so perfect, so devastatingly precise, that it bordered on the divine. Each punishment was a mirror held up to the crime, forcing the perpetrators to experience a reflection of their own sins. The galaxy watched in a state of horrified awe. This was a new form of warfare, a moral calculus of destruction that left no room for negotiation or surrender. Humanity was not conquering, it was cleansing. It was rebalancing a scale that had been tilted for half a millennium. The Concordance was dead. Its fleets were broken. Its worlds were in chaos. And its central government had effectively ceased to exist. In its place was a power vacuum filled with the terrifying, silent presence of a species that had returned from the dead to serve as the galaxy's conscience, its judge, and its executioner. And as the last of the founding species received their payment, a new, final message was broadcast from the Sol system, addressed to the trillions of souls on the 1,000 worlds that had once made up the Concordance. It was a single image, the human ledger, with every account now marked paid in full. Below it, a new line of text appeared. The audit is complete. A new ledger is now open. Let us begin with a clean slate. The age of the Concordance was over. The age of humanity had begun. The only question left was whether it would be an age of peace or an age of fear. 50 standard years had passed since the last entry was made in the Ledger of Debts. The Great Fear had slowly, almost imperceptibly, given way to the Great Work. The Terran Mandate was no longer a shadow hanging over the galaxy, but a light, albeit a blindingly bright and sometimes uncomfortable one. Humanity, the ghost that had returned to haunt its tormentors, had become the galaxy's reluctant architect. The silence of the Sol system had been replaced by a constant, vibrant hum of communication as human engineers, historians, and ethicists worked alongside the very species they had brought to their knees. The galaxy was being rebuilt, not in the image of the old concordance, but according to a new, terrifyingly honest blueprint. The Xylosian Restoration Project was the jewel in the crown of this new era. The great library of Xylos, once a monument to intellectual arrogance, was now a true galactic treasure. Its corridors, once walked only by the privileged Xylosian elite, now thronged with scholars from 100 different worlds. A young human historian named Lena, whose great-grandmother had served on a warship during the Reckoning, worked side by side with a wizened Xylosian archivist named Prax. Together, they were meticulously restoring a section of the library dedicated to pre-concordance philosophy, painstakingly cross-referencing ancient data fragments to ensure that every culture, no matter how small or long forgotten, was given its proper place. The air between them was not one of master and student, but of mutual respect. The knowledge that Lena's people had shattered Prax's entire civilization was a constant, unspoken presence. Yet it was not a barrier. It was a foundation, a shared, terrible truth upon which something new and stronger was being built. This was the great work, in practice a slow, arduous process of transforming memory from a weapon into a tool. From his observation post, Kalen of the Lorthal watched the galaxy reshape itself. He was now a senior observer, his reports to his own government read with an almost religious reverence. He saw the undeniable good the Terran Mandate had brought. Under human oversight, ancient territorial disputes had been resolved. Exploitative trade practices had been dismantled, and a universal standard of sentient rights had been established. But he also saw the cost. The galaxy had been pacified, but it had also been declawed. The vibrant, chaotic, and often dangerous tapestry of interstellar politics had been replaced by a monolithic, human-defined morality. Cultures that had once celebrated martial pride or ruthless ambition were now forced into quiet introspection, their traditions deemed suboptimal by Terran sociologists. There was no oppression, no tyranny in the traditional sense, but there was a suffocating sense of correctness, a feeling that every world was now a student in a galactic classroom, and humanity was the teacher who graded every test. The new ledger of contributions was growing, but every entry was, in some way, co-authored by humanity. The galaxy was healing, but Kalen wondered if it was forgetting how to be itself. The first tremor in this new foundation came from the ashes of the old. It came from Arden Prime. Of all the species judged during the Reckoning, the Ardani had suffered the most profound wound. Their genetics had been rewritten, their bodies weakened, their warrior culture rendered a tragic irony. For 50 years, they had endured the human-led reconstruction, accepting aid with a sullen, silent resentment. Their once proud cities were being rebuilt, their atrophied bodies treated by Terran gene therapists. But their spirit remained broken, and in that brokenness, a new, virulent pride began to grow. They called themselves the Purists. They were a movement born in the shadows, a cult of memory that rejected the human narrative of justice and instead preached a gospel of defiance. They saw the Golden Plague not as a punishment, but as a test, a crucible through which a new, stronger Ardan Imperium would be forged. They rejected Terran medicine, embracing the genetic affliction as a mark of their people's unique suffering. They secretly trained with ancient bladed weapons. their weakened muscles straining to reclaim a fraction of their former glory. They did not want help. They wanted their identity back, even if it was an identity of pain and rage. The incident occurred on a terraforming project in the Ardan Outlands, a joint venture designed to reclaim land blighted during their own ancient civil wars. A team of human ecologists and Ardan laborers were working to revitalize the soil when a squad of purists descended from the blasted hills. They were armed not with energy weapons, but with crude, sharpened metal pikes and ceremonial daggers. They did not attack the humans. Instead, they surrounded the Ardan workers, their faces contorted with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You collaborate in the desecration of our very being," the purist leader snarled, his own body gaunt and weak, but his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "You allow these aliens to patch our bodies while they poison our souls. The true Ardan embraces the pain. It is our inheritance. It is our strength." The workers, confused and afraid, tried to retreat, but the purists fell upon them, not to kill, but to mark them, carving the symbol of their movement, a broken spear, onto their flesh. The message was clear. This was an internal Ardan matter. They were cleansing their own house, and they would not tolerate Terran interference. The news of the purist attack reached the council chambers of Aegis like a forgotten disease. For 50 years, the debates had been about resource allocation and cultural exchange protocols. Now, though ugly questions of security and enforcement were dragged back into the light, General Merrick, now a silver-haired elder but with the same flint in his eyes, stood before the council, his voice laced with a bitter, vindicated fury. "I told you this would happen," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades of suppressed warning. "We showed them mercy, and they mistook it for weakness. They see our helping hand not as a gift, but as a chain. This is not a protest. It is a rebellion in its infancy. We must crush it now, utterly and without hesitation. Send a fleet. Level their camps. Remind them what the price of defiance is. The galaxy has forgotten the feel of our boot on its neck. It is time for a refresher course." His words resonated with the older generation, those who still carried the scars of the silence and the fire of the reckoning. They saw the purists not as a misguided faction, but as the ghost of the old concordance, the unkillable weed of arrogance growing back through the cracks. Chancellor Eris Thorne, her hair now streaked with gray, but her intellect as sharp as ever, rose to counter him. And what would that accomplish? "General," she asked, her voice calm but firm. "It would prove the purists' every accusation. It would make them martyrs. It would tell the galaxy that our great work is a lie, a thin veneer of benevolence over the same brutal fist we used during the reckoning. We would be confirming that fear is, and always was, our only true tool. We could not answer a rebellion of ideas with kinetic bombardment. If we do, we lose not just the Ardani, but everything we have tried to build for the last 50 years. The council was split. The younger members, like the historian Lena, who had been recalled from Xylos to testify, had been raised on the ideals of the great work. They were horrified by Merrick's proposal, but they had no answer to the purist violence. They possessed unimaginable power, yet they were paralyzed by the moral complexities of how to use it. The deadlock lasted for days. The wardens argued for security, the architects for ideals. Finally, they turned to the one man who had successfully navigated both, Admiral Jorek Thorn, now ancient and frail, his body failing, but his mind as clear as a vacuum-forged crystal, was brought before the council. He had not spoken publicly in over a decade. He listened to both sides, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. When they had finished, a long silence filled the chamber. "Merrick is right," Thorne said at last, his voice a soft rasp. "The purists are a threat. An idea can be more dangerous than a fleet. It can spread. It can curdle hope into resentment. We cannot ignore it." He opened his eyes, and they were filled not with the fire of a warrior, but with the infinite weariness of a historian. "But Aris is also right. To answer them with the weapons of the past is to admit that we have learned nothing, that we are still trapped by the cycle of violence we sought to end." He looked around the room, his gaze resting on the younger faces. "You have been taught our history. You know of our crimes against the Concordance. Now, you must learn of our crimes against ourselves." His proposal was radical, terrifying, and utterly unexpected. He did not call for a fleet or a diplomatic mission. He called for an act of total, unilateral transparency. He ordered the unsealing of the Aegis archives, the complete, unredacted history of humanity's 500 years of silence. The council was stunned. These were humanity's deepest, darkest secrets. The archives contain not just the triumphant story of their survival and rearmament, but the brutal truth of what it had cost. It detailed the failed experiments, the ruthless internal purges of dissenting factions, the generations of children raised in harsh, unforgiving environments who knew nothing but duty and hatred. It showed the psychological cost of vengeance, the societal fractures that had nearly torn their hidden civilization apart on a dozen occasions. It was the complete, unvarnished story of a people who had saved themselves by sacrificing a part of their own humanity. "We will broadcast it all," Thorne commanded, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "To every world, to the Ardani, to the Xylosians, to everyone. We will show them that we are not gods who descended from the void to pass judgment. We will show them that we are flawed, broken survivors who carry the same potential for self-destruction that they do. We will show them the abyss we stared into for 5 centuries. We will show them the monster we had to become to survive, and the struggle it has been to become something more." He leaned forward. "The purists claim their pain makes them strong. We will show them a pain they cannot imagine. And we will show them that true strength is not found in embracing the pain, but in choosing, every single day, to rise above it. We will not interfere with their civil strife. We will simply give them a better story to tell themselves." The broadcast was an act of profound vulnerability, a strategic gamble that risked everything. It was humanity's final, greatest weapon, the truth. As the data streamed across the galaxy, a new kind of silence fell on Ardan Prime. The purists and the collaborationists alike watched the raw, painful history of their overlords unfold. They saw a people who were not so different from them, a people who had been scarred by history and were still struggling to define their future. The broadcast did not end the purist movement, but it fractured it, robbing it of its simple, hateful narrative. Some saw the human confession as a trick, others as a sign of weakness. But many, for the first time, saw not a conqueror, but a fellow survivor. The great work was not over. In fact, it had just truly begun. It would not be a simple process of rebuilding, but a messy, complicated, and endless negotiation of shared histories and mutual pain. The ledger was clean, but the slate of the future was vast and empty, and as humanity voluntarily laid down its armor of myth and legend, the galaxy watched, and for the first time in 50 years. It was not with fear, but with a fragile, uncertain, and terrifying hope.